In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. You see the chessboard that I've put up. It's a symbol. We all know what the game of chess is about. It's about strategy. It's about having strategy, and it's about overcoming opposition on the chessboard. Now, that's a symbol, but in reality, moves are being made nationwide by the major political parties to manipulate descendants of slaves to vote one way or another. For many years, they have relied upon our ignorance of the strategies that they use to succeed in their manipulation. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking to you about one of the major strategies which they use, and consequently, why no matter how much we hope for change, why so much we hope for an end to police brutality, police killings of descendants of slaves and other people, of course, it's just simply not going to stop, because the politicians that are put before us are pretty much bought and paid for as a condition for even being able to compete for the political offices that they desire to have. Corporate-owned Democratic Party politicians, for example, like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, right now they're touring the Chitlin circuit. They're making their moves to present themselves to you. They know that platforms like that we call the Breakfast Club, they know that those platforms are basically set up to entertain viewers, especially young viewers, because the majority of African Americans cannot sustain for a long period of time their attention to serious, relevant, and more abstract information that we do need. So what they do is they entertain and give a little information, but it's never enough. And if you note, the questions which are asked are never really relevant enough. For example, usually there are no questions on international issues, such as the issue of Venezuela, the issue of Yemen, the issue of Palestine, the issue of Zionism. Those questions are not put forth to them because their backers would not let them appear on those shows if that were the case. But it's also a sign that if they do win the political office that they seek, they will just continue business as usual. So they're targeting us. And they're targeting us in the hope that they can mislead us into voting for them. And that is the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But I will focus on the Democratic Party right now because for some reason, which is not rational, most African Americans seem to think that the Democratic Party is going to work in their best interest, even though history proves otherwise. All of history proves otherwise. The whole of American history, or since the existence of the Democratic Party, proves otherwise. But then that proves that the fact that they've been able to sell it to the majority of descendants of slaves, that the principle that I'm going to talk to you tonight is right, that most descendants of slaves are gullible, and many are just docile. Now, their usual game plan is to go to some black churches, and of course, the preacher brings them up to the pulpit and they talk. And of course, now the internet platforms are very important to them because they know that younger generation Z and X or millennial viewers listen to those shows. They go to those shows and they strut on the platform, modeling themselves in return for support. In essence, they are no more than clever, narcissistic, opportunistic manipulators. They want to use the kinds of shows you watch to better manipulate you, because what they know is that about 80% of descendants of slaves, as I have said, are gullible. And that's proven by all of the scammers on YouTube who have succeeded in taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from you, some of you, by just selling you a picture of a school that they're going to open, or some ridiculous idea or notion that you can be a nation in and of yourself without being under the jurisdiction of federal law. And I'm thinking of this guy named Polite. That's proof that thousands of descendants of slaves are gullible, easily manipulated, and willing to give their money away. Now, they know that all one really has to do when trying to persuade descendants of slaves to be pro or con on an issue or a candidate or a person is to be politically correct for you, to be a celebrity, to express a little formal rhetoric, flash some skin for you, flash some melanated skin, and tell you exactly what you want to hear. Tell you exactly what you want to hear. And usually it works. Descendants of slaves tend to fall in love with them, or rather with their celebrity, their physical looks, and their false hope, and the false hope that they sell. You know, there's a famous saying that you know what a person loves by what they're attracted to. It's very simple. What you're attracted to, you love. Now, at the end of the day, they will get you to vote for them, and if all their image manipulation fails, they do this all the time. If all of their image manipulation fails, they will present to those gullible enough to believe the fallacious argument that they are the lesser of two evils. And they always have a backup plan. They always have a plan A, they always have a plan B, etc. Now, but given all of that, what is it that they know about you that is so deep and mysterious? I'd like to talk about that. The answer is that what they know is the mathematical probability called the 80-20 rule, or the law of the vital minority. What the law of the vital minority simply states is that 80% of all the effects that occur in society, like inventions and so forth, are the result of 20% of the population. For example, if you take an insurance company, 80% of all the sales would be the effect of 20% of the insurance agents. Now, each of these political personalities identify themselves with the vital minority. Like the Brahmins of Hinduism, they do not identify with us, with people like you and me. Their lifelong worth as persons will be measured in terms of how much wealth they can take from you or how much fame they can persuade you to give to them. Now, here's a table from the Federal Reserve Bank that reflects the 80-20 rule economically, because it also applies economically. And you can see that the richest 20% of the population are responsible for 80% of the national income. That conforms perfectly with the 80-20 rule that I'd like you to understand tonight. Now, historically, some African American scholars have understood that. One was W.E.B. He was a contemporary of Pareto. He understood the 80-20 principle, and he enshrined it in his book, The Negro Problem, but he called it the talented 10th. Now, at that time, because most African Americans were illiterate, of course, they didn't know what he was talking about. They had never heard of the 80-20 rule. They didn't know the economist, sociologist Pareto. But W.E.B. had the idea that if he could persuade the talented 10th, the educated descendants of slaves, to educate and uplift the 90%, we would be on our way to success. But he was wrong. What happened was that they just simply exploited other descendants of slaves, both for themselves and for white supremacists. Now, that is exactly what happened also in the nation of Liberia. Liberia was a nation set aside for African American slaves who were freed after the Civil War. You could go to Liberia and it was your nation. Just up until recently, the law stated that we could have dual citizenship as African Americans with Liberia. That was changed under the Obama administration. Now, what happened was the free slaves who went to Liberia started Freemasonry and played the same hierarchical game that white supremacists play on us in Liberia. What they did was they exploited the indigenous African people. They allowed American corporations into Liberia, corporations like Firestone Rubber Company, to subject the indigenous people to slavery. And that went on, of course, until there was a revolution in Liberia. Now, your betrayal by descendants of slaves, or as Malcolm X called them, the house Negroes, was plotted hundreds of years ago. W.E.B., remember, got his idea from the sociologist, economist Vilfredo Pareto, who died in 1923. So most of you don't understand that principle. You don't know how politically effective it is in your lives, and how that rule and the vital minority concept determine how you are manipulated via the media, and why most of you will always fall for it. You have a lot to learn. So limited is your self-determination that what you eat, drink, wear, think about, and where you live is generally caused by about 20% of the population. It is caused by people you will never see. You will never see a picture of them. You will never see them on television. And you won't even know they exist. But they are causing to be the basic structure of your life, of your lives. Another measurable effect of the 80-20 rule is that most descendants of slaves are highly gullible to different forms of rhetoric on media, such as television and now YouTube. Now, what I've done is I've prepared a bar graph to do the 80-20 analysis. Now, here is a list of YouTube channels that I selected. It is a cross-section of some well-known platforms that I picked to make the point. I constructed this graph to prove that the 80-20 rule divides the DOS community. And of course, it could be applied to 100 other channels that cater to the interests of descendants of slaves. So you can do it too. Now, here, I want you to see that 3 shows out of 17 have control or influence on the opinions and feelings of over 384,736 viewers in this 1 week period of time that I did my analysis. Those 3 groups constitute approximately 20% of the shows I chose. What that means is that this graph conforms, it proves the 80-20 rule. Now, the graph makes that point. So though you may think you're forming your opinions, you are less thoughtful than you think you are in reality. And on a broader scale, you're even less thoughtful. If you look on this graph, at the far right side of the graph, then slowly pan your sight to the left, you will see that there are different shows which I have reduced to 7 general categories. They are from largest to smallest. Number 1, shows on mythology. Number 2, scam shows, shows that are aimed at scamming you to give money for some imaginary project. And of course, opinion rhetorical shows, shows that are rhetorical in nature. 3, ideological shows, or shows that are pretty much more intellectually oriented, lecture oriented. 4, a family oriented show. 5, a step and fetch it show. And 6, a brand identity show that suggests status. Status is defined by what one wears. Now, there may be some overlap between some of them, but that does not alter the statistical outcome defined by the bar graph. Exactly what the bar graph defines is that 80% of the viewers are influenced by only 20% or 3 of the shows that I've listed for that week. How should we go about understanding what the 80-20 rule means? Well, you can see that the shows, the 2 shows that have to do with brand identity and status, draw the most viewers. They draw the most viewers. What that means is that if we gathered other brand identity shows and we took the same week, and we counted up their viewers, they would outperform, or they outperform most all other shows on YouTube. What does that tell you about what young African Americans are interested in? They're interested in material things. They're interested in frivolous material things. They're not interested in understanding the strategies that are being played on them and how they're being manipulated. They are willing to give hundreds of dollars over for a pair of shoes that they then would be too concerned about wearing because they wouldn't want to get them dirty. That's how bad the situation is for us. That's how gullible the mass majority of African American youth are. And I'm talking about youth in their 20s and 30s, not necessarily just teenagers. Now, how can we philosophically, how can we understand this? What is happening? What is the mindset that we are dealing with? Because we are continually manipulated and exploited economically. There's one way that I found that may help us to categorize and understand why there's this 80% of gullible people that are easily exploited politically and economically. It's called the divided line. And I think it can help us to understand why technology works. But it can also help us to understand how we might preempt it from working. If you look at this divided line, you'll see that it is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. A, B, C, and D. And those 4 sections represent different parts of the population. Different parts of the population. If you look at the bottom, you'll see, the far end, you'll see A. And A, of course, here on this chart that I'm showing you, represents the lower quarter of the divided line, where people who believe in images and they imagine things that aren't there, they have illusions, they are attracted to appearances and misunderstand the nature of reality because they're looking at appearances and making judgments about appearances and do not understand the principle behind the appearances. And then if you look at the next category, B, you're dealing with people who are predisposed to believe without evidence. They believe in visible things. They overlap, of course, with people who are more oriented to their sensations as a basis for understanding reality. So both of these categories are problematic. And politicians, of course, target these 2 categories more often because they are more gullible, they are more subject or likely to be manipulated. As you move into the next category, you see thinking about mathematical objects. Now, these are people who are more intelligent and less likely to be gullible or manipulated by these politicians or corporations or other groups that have it in mind to take things from you and maybe even your life. And at the highest level, you have people who experience forms of reality. They are highly intelligent, knowledgeable people, and many of them do try to uplift the people who are in the other categories, A and B, with not much success, because this seems to be, according to this paradigm, a constant in every population. In other words, the assumption is that these are mental orientations that you're just simply going to have in every population. And so the problem for us is, how do we protect ourselves? Well, it's a tough task. It's really tough. And there's more failure than success because we are not in charge of our own destiny here. So over 80% of all the scientists in the United States are white. Very few African Americans are in the sciences. Now, 20% of them are responsible for 80% of all the social, scientific, economic, and health information and chaos that we experience. It's undeniable. We're not very self-determinate in this society. Now, historically, we can understand this because we know why slave masters picked some slaves to be preachers and why they picked some to work in the house. We know why some biblical verses were chosen for slave preachers to use and why that tradition continues today. We know they were chosen to rationalize the institution of slavery. Their job was to sell slavery to slaves as being natural for melanated people. All that was predicated on that idea of the 80% of the slave population who would be gullible, naturally predisposed to believe what they were told, to be conformist, to walk the walk and talk the talk, and sometimes simply because they were kept ignorant and weak. Now, during slavery, 20% of slaves who were preachers or who worked in the house and who were used to influence the field slaves were given more food and clothes. That's the same method applied today. The politicians who will conform to the interest of the corporations are given money. They have nice homes. They live a nice life. And when they're in Congress, they have free health care. They have all kinds of benefits and perks. They get to travel. They're living a Hollywood life. So, of course, they are like the house Negro on the plantation. They don't want to lose that. So they tell you anything, and they get into office, and they do exactly what their political bosses tell them to do. And of course, the political bosses are doing what their corporate masters are telling them to do. And it's all hocus pocus. And here you are believing the rhetoric, believing the philosophical and high-minded rhetoric that they express to you, that they're going to do something for you, they're going to work for you, and in reality, they're just lying to you to get into office. And they know the lies are going to work. They've worked before because they are targeting that gullible mass of people who make judgments based upon appearances. They want to see celebrity. They want to see the kind of clothes you're wearing. They want to see how you speak. They want to imitate you. And they know that those people are easily manipulated. And so for that reason, they have a high level of confidence that they're going to succeed in manipulating a large percentage of African Americans. Now, today, there is a change taking place amongst what historically have been the elite bourgeois African Americans, and their numbers are dwindling for a lot of different reasons. And so what white supremacists have been doing for a couple of decades is recruiting immigrant Africans and people of Caribbean ancestry to take their place, to be the new elite who will manipulate you, the 80%ers of descendants of slaves born in the United States. In fact, their mission is to define a new narrative for African Americans, because the white supremacists want people in positions in the media and in colleges and universities who are not going to be concerned about the unique history that our people have experienced. The tasks before us are monumental. They're monumental. And I must admit that I am more pessimistic than optimistic that we have a chance to better our conditions generally. The facts compel me to conclude that all of us will not overcome the many obstacles set before us, because there are 80% of descendants of slaves who will continually repeat the mistakes of previous generations, and elite white supremacists. They know that. They know that with a near mathematical certainty. So for those of us who do understand, for those of us who do care, we have a lot of work to do, and we don't have a lot of time left to do it. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.